Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'll be spending the next few minutes taking you through our findings from the non-university higher education providers who took part in our survey. Now, while not all of these colleges were definitive pathway colleges, we will be using that term as a placeholder to represent this cohort for the time being. So we had a pretty good survey response from our pathway participants. There were 4 colleges in total with 961 students and 96 teaching staff participating. And while most of us probably have a reasonable understanding of what pathway colleges are, I'll describe them briefly just so we're all on the same page before I start unpacking the survey results. In terms of higher education institutions, pathway colleges are classified as NUHEPs, non-university higher education providers. Many are partnered with Australian universities to provide an alternative way for students to attend a particular university. Thus the name Pathway. There are predominantly private colleges that provide programs which allow students to then transition to first or second year university courses. In 2016, of the 200 higher education providers that were registered with TEXA, 154 were NUHEPs, so that's a significant number. And many of those are pathway colleges or other institutions like vocational education training colleges or ELICOS colleges. About 7% of all students in higher education are in NUHEP programs. And some of the characteristics of pathway colleges in terms of their environments are that they tend to have smaller class sizes, which in theory allows for a more intimate learning and teaching relationship between instructors and students. Many colleges offer language support to build up the international students' English language skills before they move on to university. The majority of pathway students are studying management and commerce and will eventually enter first or second year university degree programs in those disciplines. And in terms of facilities, many pathway colleges are centrally located in capital cities, making them an attractive option for younger students and international students to attend. They share, in many cases, the same facilities and resources and infrastructure as their partner universities, which then allows the students to sort of dip their toe in a university environment outside of their normal classes. Okay, so here are some of the key demographics from our pathway cohort of 961 students. They're actually quite comparable to the university cohort in terms of percentages, with the exception of 2 variables. The majority of the students were under 25. 31% were enrolled in foundation or pathway courses and were looking to likely progress to university. Just over half were already enrolled in undergraduate programs or equivalent programs. And unlike the university cohort, there were more females than males taking part in the survey. There were more than twice the percentage of international students. There were fewer students studying internally in than the university cohort, but more students in blended learning programs. And there were less pathway students studying full-time compared to the university peers. Across both cohorts, the top disciplines were health sciences and business and commerce. And unsurprisingly, given the much higher percentage of international students, fewer pathway students spoke English at home compared to the university cohort, but even so at 67%, that's a pretty high percentage. Okay, which brings us to the survey. Now in the survey, we asked the pathway students exactly the same questions as the university cohort. Now, in terms of the experiences and attitudes with outsourcing and contract cheating, we asked them about these 7 behaviors, which Rowena and Tracy have already explained to you. And you'll find them at the top of your infographic that we handed out. The first 2 behaviors in the spectrum can be classified as the sharing behaviors, which don't tend to be explicitly prohibited, while the remaining 5 behaviors are your more egregious behaviors, which we might normally classify as cheating. So we asked the students if they'd ever engaged in these 7 behaviors, and this was what they reported. You'll see all 7 behaviors ranked from most prevalent to least prevalent, and the comparisons between the pathway and university students across all of those behaviors. Now, the biggest difference between the two cohorts was reported in both of the sharing behaviors in the spectrum. So buying, trading, or selling notes was almost 2 times the percentage of university students reporting that same behavior. And providing a completed assignment to another student, where pathway students reported less instances of this behavior compared to university peers. So those two behaviors are where we find the biggest difference between our pathway students and our university students. While pathway students reported similar rates of obtaining a completed assignment from another student with the intention to submit, they were 6 times more likely to pay for that assignment compared to university peers. When it came to the more definitive 5 cheating behaviors, pathway students reported higher rates of engagement in 4 out of the 5 behaviors, and all of them involving exams. Now, similar to the university students, we asked the pathway students how wrong they thought the 7 behaviors were, and then we combined the responses which indicated agree and strongly agree. Now, the findings were quite similar across all 7 behaviors, though from the chart we can see that university students tended to feel more strongly that these behaviors were wrong, with this interesting exception of buying, trading, or selling notes, which is one of the 2 sharing behaviors. Pathway students felt very differently about this, with about 20% more of them agreeing that the behavior was wrong compared to university students. In terms of how the students feel about their lecturers and tutors teaching, the view is actually quite positive from the pathway students' perspective. In all of the teaching and learning factors that we investigated, pathway students agreed or strongly agreed at a higher percentage than university students, with one exception. So both pathway and university students felt quite strongly that they had opportunities to approach their instructors and that academic integrity policy and assignment instructions was explained to them. The difference between these 2 cohorts, however, starts to become more pronounced in terms of instructors providing sufficient feedback and teaching referencing. So less than half of the university students agreed or strongly agreed that the instructors taught them about referencing, compared to the much higher agreement from the pathway students of 70%. There was much lower rates of agreement from both cohorts when it came to the instructors monitoring and penalizing breaches, which may be understandable because these sorts of things happen behind the scenes and students may not actually be aware of what the teachers are doing about them. The rate of agreement was also very low for explaining contract cheating for both cohorts, although more than double the percentage of pathway students agreed or strongly agreed that the instructors did, in fact, explain about contract cheating. And finally, on a more positive note, fewer pathway students felt that there were opportunities to cheat compared to the university students. Okay. All right, so moving on to the staff responses, 96 Pathway College staff took part in the survey. So we asked the staff, how are they actually detecting? How are they actually finding out about these cases? And one of the most significant factors that arose from that question was their knowledge of the student. So just being aware of who your students are. Knowledge of the student's academic ability and what they can do in class and the work that they produce in class. Knowledge of the student's language ability, and some of the educators actually got tips from other students. And that was at a rate that was twice the percentage of what was happening at university. So more pathway students apparently feel more at ease in perhaps approaching their instructor to let them know that this was happening. Pathway college staff seem to be better informed about what happens after they've reported a case. So in pathway colleges, 12% of staff reported that they were unaware of what had happened after they had reported a case, and the percentage was more than twice higher at universities, with 25% of staff not knowing what happened after they had lodged a case. In terms of penalties, the penalties seemed to be more consistent at pathway colleges. There were 83% of cases where 0 marks were awarded to students compared to universities. So there seems to be a more consistent approach to dealing with what happens in outsourcing cases being reported at pathway colleges. In terms of perceptions of wrongness and staff's concern about contract cheating, there were highly comparable attitudes between pathway and university staff, but pathway staff were more concerned about contract cheating in general, 54% versus university staff at 46%. So we asked pathway staff what they thought about their learning and teaching activities and their learning and teaching environment. So once again, the attitudes between both sets of staff were highly comparable, but pathway staff were much more confident in their learning and in the teaching of referencing compared to university staff, and this happens to align with the satisfaction ratings of students as well. Pathway staff were more satisfied with what their institutions were doing to minimize contract cheating, especially concerning workload and teaching and class sizes, which we'll see were the same factors that arose out of Marina's data. So we asked pathway staff, have they ever engaged in contract cheating as staff? 0% reported at pathway colleges. We asked them if they ever engaged in contract cheating when they were students. And the rates are very similar to what we're seeing in the literature, around 10%. So similar for both pathway and university staff. So those were some of the highlights from the survey that we conducted. The findings from our pathway cohort are particularly interesting because here we have students who felt quite positively about their learning and teaching environment, but who nevertheless reported higher rates of 4 out of the 5 cheating behaviors that we investigated in the study. And in the instances where they reported obtaining a completed assignment, they were 6 times more likely to pay for it, but at the same time, less likely to pass it on to other students. So what this may imply is that the pathway students who report cheating are not quite as active within a network of students who are behaving similarly. So in comparison to university students who may have had more time and exposure to certain contagious behaviors. So this has implications for the types of approaches and resources that we can design for pathway students, particularly since both pathway and university students reported very low levels of agreement as to their instructors informing them about what contract cheating was about. One of the recommendations from the project that Tracy already talked about was to recognize the particular needs of international and LOTE students. And this has implications for how pathway colleges respond to contract cheating because of their high number of international students. So 60% of all international students in higher education have actually been enrolled at a NUHEP college at some point in their academic career. So I think we have an opportunity here to harness some of the postulated positive characteristics of pathway education, your small class sizes, more individual attention, all of which are aspects of the personalized learning and teaching relationship that we're recommending as a holistic response to contract cheating.